Hello, this is my second lecture in the series of lectures that I give to undergraduates who are just starting their learning in economics. It's from chapter 2 of my book, which is Markets and the Theory of Price. It's one of 10 lectures which will take us through microeconomics and macroeconomics, introducing both of those to you. It's obviously a false division between microeconomics and macroeconomics, because in economics there's just the very small, which is the consumer, and there's the very large, which is the world economy. We may, of course, in the future move from a world economy with international trade into intergalactic trade, but as yet, I think we've got a few moon rocks here, but as yet that hasn't taken off. So the limit to the size of our studies is the world economy at the large end and the consumer at the small end. But for convenience, we're going to separate macro and micro, where micro deals with the consumer, firms, industries, and macro deals with national economies and international economies. So we're going to start today on what I'm going to call points of interest in market theory. You'll remember from lecture 1 I explained that in my opinion probably 90% of all resources are better allocated through marketplace and marketplaces than they are through governments intervening and commanding a certain level of resource allocation to go in a certain direction. So I think markets are important, and as our lead into macroeconomics, we're going to look at some points of interest in market theory. We're going to concentrate mainly on the demand side of the market in this lecture. In the next lecture, we will concentrate mainly on the supply side of the market, and then the lecture after that, we will look at illustrations of how markets fail and how we need to have alternative arrangements for those markets that do fail. So, we need to recognise that there are 3 levels of demand that we look at in economics. 2 of them are at the micro level and 1 at the macro level. That is, if we look at consumer demand, the individual demand, then that's 1 level. If we add all consumers together into a marketplace, then we can look at market demand. And then if we add all markets together for a whole economy, we look at aggregate demand, but we won't be looking at aggregate demand until we get to the macroeconomics section of this course. So it's just consumer demand and market demand that are the emphasis of this particular lecture. One of the things we have to look at, it's a critical assumption of microeconomics and consumer behaviour, is whether consumers are rational or not. There are lots of economists that like to move from straight into irrational and chaos theory and complications that I'm quite happy that they exist, but we come to them next. To make life easy and simple, let us assume that all consumers are rational. Now I ask my students what they think a rational consumer is, and they usually come up with, if they go shopping, they're going to buy products that they want. That's a rational decision. Buying products you don't want doesn't seem to be a rational decision. And also, if they're faced with an opportunity to buy exactly the same product at 2 different prices, it's rational to choose the cheaper price, not the more expensive one. So we get some idea of rational in that sense into the students, and then of course I ask them the question, can they tell me or give me examples of something that they have bought that was a totally irrational decision? Irrational in the sense that they look at it now and go, I shouldn't have bought that, or they've never used it or something. And of course every student will come up with an example of a CD that they bought and never listened to, a computer game that they bought and never played, clothes that they bought and never wore, shoes particularly they bought and they never wore. So what I'm trying to say here is that all consumers don't have to be rational, and all consumers aren't rational all of the time. But if we said all consumers were irrational, it would be very difficult to build models, at least simple models, in economics. And of course, all consumers are rational most of the time, but not all of the time, as my students always illustrate to me. So we're going to start with an idea of rational decision making in markets when consumers choose which products they want to buy. Now, one of the things we need to get clear when we're developing this idea of consumer behaviour is the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now, all this law says is that if a consumer consumes more and more of the same product, and technically it would have to be exactly the same point in time, because it's a totally different thing if it's different points in time, but if they consume more and more of the same product, they may get more usefulness out of it, more utility from it, but it will diminish straight away. The second time, the amount of usefulness they get will be less than the first time, third time less than the second time, and so on. In other words, there's a law of diminishing marginal utility. As you consume more, the total usefulness that you get from the product can increase, but it will always increase by smaller and smaller amounts. So the law of diminishing marginal utility is, again, a very important assumption alongside our rational consumer. And we assume that when people go out to purchase things, that they aim to maximise the amount of utility that they get from all of their purchases. Now, as economists, we have technical terms for this. We talk about them equating the marginal utility of the last unit of money that they spend on each product. That's a sort of technical explanation. Of course, people don't go out and shop in that way, but they do think about what things they consider will give them most value for money, and a rational consumer will buy things that will give them most utility. And when they do that, it actually comes down to a point that they are equating the marginal usefulness or marginal utility of the last unit of money that they spend on each of the products that they buy. So we know a little bit about consumers now. They're rational, and they try and equate the marginal utilities of the last unit of money that they spend on each of the products that they purchase. Now, you will find, if you look at in my book, that there are a couple of curves, functions that are useful to help us explain quite a few things in consumer economics, and they're indifference curves and budget lines. And an indifference curve would look like this. If there were two products, Y and X, which is product Y and product X on those axes, there are different combinations of these two products that would give me the same total usefulness. So as I move along one of these lines, what I'm talking about is different combinations of X and Y that give me the same total utility, the same amount of usefulness. And of course, indifference curves can move away from the origin or towards the origin. There's a whole, what's called a map of indifference curves. As you move away, those indifference curves are joining together combinations that will give you higher total utility. As you move to the origin, they would give you lower total utilities. And the law of diminishing marginal utility means that the indifference curve must have this shape. It cannot not have this shape and subscribe to that law of diminishing marginal utility. Because each time I take away one unit, say I take away one X, I could compensate by adding Y. If I take away another X, I've got to compensate by adding even more Y. Remember, diminishing marginal utility. Another X, even more. That's what gives the indifference curve this shape. Now put that together with a budget line, and a budget line is something different, but we're looking at the same two products here. We're looking at products X and Y, and we're looking at lines which are our budget limit. So given a certain amount of income at a certain point in time, there's a maximum amount of X we could buy, a maximum amount of Y we could buy, or any combination along that line. Now where they're parallel to each other, it's just that my income is higher as I move away from the origin, so I can buy more of both, or my income is lower as I move closer to the origin, which means that I can buy less of both. There's also a little pivot on there as well on the y-axis where an indifference curve starts at the same point on the x-axis but goes to a different point on the y-axis, and it's because the price of y has gone up. So y, I can now buy less of y, but I can also buy exactly the same amount of x. So that's pivoted around that point on the x-axis. So these are budget lines. Put these two things together and they tell you where the consumer maximising position is when they go out shopping. The consumer maximising equilibrium is where the budget line just touches, is tangent to the indifference curve that's furthest away from the origin. So in this case here, the budget line just touches an indifference curve at y1, x1. And that will be the point at which I will get maximum total utility. So we're putting the two things together. The indifference curve is joining together all the combinations that give me the same amount of total utility. So I'm indifferent to any of those combinations because they all give me the same total utility. But the budget line tells me what I can afford. So I will want to touch the furthest indifference curve away from the origin, and that's the point at which I maximise utility. Technically, it's the point at which the marginal utility of x divided by its price equals the marginal utility of y divided by its price. That is, I've equated the utility I get from the last unit of money I spend on both products. So that's a little bit about what the consumer gets up to as an individual. The next thing is to put all of this together into what's called a demand function. Now a demand function, for convenience, looks at two variables. We don't want to look at more than two, at least to start with. Multivariate analysis comes later, but in this case here, a demand function looks at the relationship between the two most important things in the marketplace. That's the quantity you buy and the price you pay. So it's a function for the relationship between price and quantity. And in a normal situation, normal demand curves would look like that. They're all downward sloping from left to right. The obvious explanation is when the price goes down, more of this product is bought. When the price goes up, less of this product is bought. The reason more of this product is bought when the price goes down is that the utility everyone gets from each pound they spend, or each unit of money they spend, has increased, so they buy more, and more people can afford to buy this product. So a normal functional relationship between demand is that it slopes downward from left to right. When I move along any of these lines, then I'm changing the price and the quantity. It's quite possible that this function could shift its position. Now when it shifts its position, what's happening is more or less of the product is being demanded at the same price. Important to remember as this comes back occasionally in economics. So a movement up and down the demand function is because price changes. More or less is demanded because price changes. A shift in the demand function occurs when more or less is demanded at the same price. So the next thing we want to separate is the normal good from the inferior good. The normal good and the inferior good are separated by one relationship, and unfortunately it isn't the relationship between price and quantity, it's the relationship between income and the quantity you would demand. For normal good, if your income goes up, you will not buy any less of this product and you will probably buy more. If your income goes down, you won't buy any more of this product, you will probably buy less. That's a normal relationship between you having more income and less income and the product. There are, however, and I'll mention a little bit more about this in a minute, inferior goods. And inferior goods have exactly the opposite relationship with income. That is, if my income goes up, I buy less of the inferior good. If my income goes down, I buy more of the inferior good. Seems strange, so I will explain it in a little bit more detail. And there's one other aspect of this which can become also a little bit awkward, much more detail in the book. But this is the relationship between the income and substitution effect of a price change. Because when prices change, that has an income effect to me. If the price goes down, my income will buy more. If the price goes up, my income will buy less. So when a price goes down, there is an income effect and a substitution effect. When the price goes down, the income effect is my real income has gone up in relation to that product. The substitution effect, however, is that I can get more utility from every unit of money I spend on this product because the price has gone down. Now, if the income effect is greater than the substitution effect, I actually get a perverse demand curve, not a normal demand curve. But if the income effect is greater than the substitution effect, no, the other way around. If the income effect is less than the substitution effect, then it's still a normal product with a normal demand curve. So it is important to understand, and you can see from my confusion there, that it's a little bit more difficult to understand the income and substitution effect of price changes. So if we wanted to put these on a diagram, a normal demand curve is the line downward sloping from left to right, dn, n for normal. The other line is dp, where the upward sloping demand curve is considered to be a perverse demand curve. It's not doing what you would expect because people are demanding more of this product when the price goes up, but less when the price goes down. One type of inferior good illustrates that, and there are two other types of products that we identify for simplicity to make this point, and they are called conspicuous consumption and speculative goods. Conspicuous consumption, a status symbol good, is probably the best example, but conspicuous consumption is where you buy something that you can make other people aware of the fact that you bought this thing. It may be something you wear and it's got labels on it that are quite clear. It may be something that's got a particular shape, so people will always know that you bought that particular thing. It may be a watch or something like that, which is easily recognisable. Now here, quite interestingly, if you put the price up, it takes on another characteristic which allows you to display wealth. So you don't want to display wealth by showing that you're wearing something that's cheap. You want to display wealth by showing that you can pay a higher price for something. So there is a conspicuous consumption product where people demand more of that product when the price is higher and less when the price is lower. So it has this perverse relationship, not a normal relationship, between price and quantity demanded. The second of these is the speculative product, and those of you interested in markets and stock markets will know exactly what I mean here, because you haven't got perfect information, and quite often when you see the price of a share rising, you might be attracted to buy it in anticipation that it will continue rising. Equally, when it starts to fall in price, you may want to get rid of that particular product and protect your loss by selling that product. So there's a sort of range, a speculative range, over which people are attracted to buy things when the price is going up and discouraged from buying things when the price goes down, because the expectation is that they will continue to go up further or down further. So there's two examples, if you like, of a perverse demand curve, and the third one is an inferior good, but it's the inferior good obviously that has the perverse demand curve, not the normal demand curve, dependent upon the relationship between income and substitution, given a special name. It's called a Giffen good, and this is because Sir Robert Giffen identified that if we go back into the 19th century, when the price of bread rose, people bought less of it. When the price of bread fell, people bought more of it, which he thought was rather strange. And this is why, because when you're very poor, then spending on staple foodstuffs becomes a large part of your income. So if the price goes down, you have a significant increase in your real income, and you may decide that you want to buy an alternative to your staple foodstuff. You might want to buy yourself a nice big donut or cake. I take an exceptional illustration by that point, I suppose. But when the price of bread goes up, you can't afford that cake, that treat, so you don't buy that and you substitute by buying more bread. So what you find is the Giffen good often is related to staple foodstuffs, and by definition, because you use this word inferior, you are assuming that there is a superior alternative for this product. And we consider cakes to be a superior alternative to bread, and therefore if your income rises, you might reduce your consumption of bread, increase your consumption of cakes, and vice versa. So almost all products have a sort of normal relationship between price and changes in income, but there are some perverse relationships that are quite interesting, and conspicuous consumption is quite interesting, particularly from the point of view of a business, because if you're selling products which people can't use to display wealth, forget it. But if you're selling products that people can use to display wealth, then you can often think very carefully about the price that you set, irrespective of the costs of producing the product, because this price will take on different characteristics when the price is higher that might be attractive to people, and they might want to be seen wearing your product because it's got a nice badge on it, because it's got a nice name on it, because it's got a strange shape, because it's easily recognisable by other people who can go, yeah, that's obviously, they spent some money on that, that must be someone who's very well off, which is often what people want to illustrate, isn't it, as they display their wealth. We also need to recognise the fact, I mean, we've identified these functions, these slopes, as normal if they're downward sloping from left to right. But we haven't said anything about how steep the fall might be or how shallow the fall might be. In other words, if I lower the price, there might be a small increase in demand, or there might be a big increase in demand. And economists, we measure that slope, if you like, by identifying an elasticity for the product. Now, this is very simple, you'll be pleased to know. But if I just took a straight line, that's the demand curve sloping down from left to right, and I've just joined it to both the axes to illustrate this particular point, then I can work out the elasticity of every point on this line just by measuring it with a ruler. I can go to point B and I can measure down that line to the horizontal axis, and I can go from point B and measure on that line up to the vertical axis, and the distances are the same. Now if I put one distance over the other, which is the distance to the x-axis over the distance to the y-axis, then I'm going to get the answer 1, because they're going to be the same number. If I took position A, for A I'm going to go down to the x-axis and then up to the y-axis, the vertical axis, and I'm going to get a number which is greater than 1, because A is down to the horizontal axis is a further distance than A up to the vertical axis. So I get an elasticity which is greater than 1. And if I go down to C, I'm going to measure the distance down to the horizontal axis and divide it by the distance to the vertical axis. I'm now going to get an answer which is less than 1. Now that's quite important, because it does mean that every point going down this line has a different elasticity. Now you might say, well, why is that important? Isn't this just economists playing around with things? Well, it is actually quite important, again, to businessmen. Because when you lower the price here, I'm going to continually get more demand. Every time I lower the price, I get more demand. But I get more demand and consumers pay more money as I move down the demand curve through A to B. If I carry on lowering the price after B, I'm going to get more sold, but I'm actually going to get less revenue from selling it. That's quite significant. And so significant, in fact, that there are people who've made a mistake, if you like, in business, and thought we're making losses, we need to sell more, and they lower their price, they make bigger losses, lower their price, make big losses, go out of business. Another businessman who sees exactly what's going on, buys the company for nothing, goes in there, reduces the amount that they supply in the market and raises the price, and takes himself back into a profitable position. So there are examples of that happening, and it's obviously those businessmen who know something about how changes in price affect the amount of money spent rather than the quantity that's sold. Now, one is quite interesting, that middle point there, because there is a curve which has 1 over the whole curve, and it's called a rectangular hyperbola, and it's that dotted line there, D. That's a rectangular hyperbola because every single point along that line is equidistant from both axes. And the interesting thing about the elasticity 1 is that if I charged £3 for this product, I'd sell 10. I'd get £30. If I lowered the price to 2, I'd sell 15. I'd get £30. If I lowered the price to 1, I'd sell 30. I get £30. Whatever price I charge, I'll always get the same revenue when the elasticity is 1. When the elasticity value is greater than 1, I need to lower my price to get more revenue. When the elasticity is less than 1, I need to raise my price to get more revenue. That's useful and interesting information, isn't it? Supply curves now. Let's have a quick look at supply curves, because although I'm concentrating on demand here, just to make a market I do need people to supply things, and I'm going to look into how they supply things in the next lecture 3. But supply curves are exactly the opposite. They just slope upwards from left to right, meaning that as the price of the product goes up, so individual firms are attracted to produce more, and more firms are attracted to come into the market. Individual firms produce more because it's more profitable to produce more at a higher price. More firms enter the market because they may not be as efficient, but if the price keeps going up, they can enter the market with higher prices, but they leave the market fairly quickly as the price falls. Now, and this is one, the mathematicians will enjoy this one, but you see you've got two supply curves there, one that looks steeper than the other, but they both have exactly the same elasticity of 1, because any straight line that would go through the origin of the graph has the same percentage changes on both axes. It can be proved with similar triangles. I won't try and do that today, but if anyone's interested, they can play around with this and see that a unitary supply curve, one with a value of 1, is any straight line that goes through the origin of the graph, which is great fun if you've got nothing to do on a Sunday afternoon. Now, we can put both of these curves together to produce our simple marketplace. So our simple marketplace has a product with a demand curve that's normal, downward sloping from left to right. It has a supply curve that's normal, upward sloping from left to right. And where it crosses is what's called the equilibrium, or the position of balance. So in this case here, price 2. Quantity 2 is what's demanded by consumers, and it is also what's supplied by producers. So it is the equilibrium position. Now I'll say a little bit more about equilibriums in a minute. But if the price was set too high, say at P1, you can see quite clearly that the quantity demanded would be less, Q1, but the quantity supplied would be more, Q3. There'd be a surplus in the market. Now, if there's a surplus in the market, people will want to get rid of that surplus, so prices go down. This is market forces. You can see those arrows. If the price is set above equilibrium, there are arrows, there are forces to push you back towards equilibrium, because no one wants to be left with unsold products. So the first thing they will do is try and offer 2 for the price of 1, or half the price, or whatever. If you've been to a market in the centre of your town, you know, the Wednesday market or the Monday market or a farmer's market or whatever, you can see this in action if you just sort of sit and watch during the day that a price is set, and if it's not selling as many as was expected during the day, and towards the end of the day the price tends to slip down, the special offers come because we want to clear this product by the end of the day. So that's market forces. The opposite happens if the price is too low. If the price is too low, you will have P3, quantity 1 will be supplied, but quantity 3 will be demanded. So there'll be a big shortage in this market, which gives businessmen an opportunity, traders an opportunity, producers an opportunity to make more profits, because they can raise their price, and by raising their price they will reduce demand, taking you back to this sort of equilibrium position, this position of balance in the middle. And again, it's market forces which do all of these things. Now, pricing, market forces and equilibrium positions are again not the favourite of lots of economists who lecture to students, because they say, no, markets are not like that, markets are chaotic, there's no equilibrium position, there's no point of balance in marketplaces. And of course, well, they are right, there isn't, because there are so many variables and so many things going on. Time just changes everything. So why have we gone all the way through this? Well, we've gone all the way through this to show you something which hopefully makes sense and allows you then to build on the more difficult aspects of market theory once you've got some basic ideas in your mind. And what I would say, realistically, is for markets there is always a tendency towards equilibrium. course, equilibriums are never achieved. Equilibriums might change every hour of every day in a marketplace. But the tendency, you might get a shock in the marketplace, which will suddenly cause things to be too high or too low. But then the reaction to that shock will always be forces bringing you back towards equilibrium, a point of balance. So whenever I argue with economists who tell me that there's no such thing as equilibrium theory, I say, well, of course there isn't in reality, but in theory there is something we can explain that people can understand, and then they can add these other behavioural factors, they can add on these other things which will help them understand what's going on in marketplaces. So marketplaces don't create equilibriums, but they always tend towards equilibriums, and market forces are what bring them closer and closer to those points of balance. Now, the whole thing about these prices and these marketplaces is that they allocate resources. In my mind, they allocate resources more efficiently than any other system that I've known. They allocate resources efficiently, and they reallocate resources efficiently, because consumers continually change, new products, new ideas, things go in fashion, out of fashion. And as demand increases for one particular firm's product, so the demand curve shifts outward and they take the advantage of raising their price and making more profits. But for someone else, it's gone exactly the other way. So prices go down, they start to contract their output, resources are released, and they go to the firm which is successful, away from the firm that's unsuccessful. So the thing about market forces is that they do exactly that. They make resources move around the economy in the way that the consumer wants. So they respond to consumers, and they efficiently allocate and reallocate resources. Now, there are, of course, plenty of examples of often interference, but not always. If we go back to this, there are situations where prices do actually get fixed too high. One thing against the Common Agricultural Policy and the EEC, which became our good friends, the EU, was that they set minimum prices for agricultural products which were too high. And they kept producing surpluses of these products that they couldn't get rid of in the marketplace. So there are some difficult decisions then. Do we destroy these things? Do we give them to third world countries? Because third world countries may not want them because it destroys their own indigenous farming industry. So there are problems when you fix prices too high, because you're going to get surpluses continuously. Equally, prices often get fixed too low in some marketplaces because of lack of information, and that often happens at sporting events, prestigious sporting events, at concerts, particularly rock concerts, and people who are popular at any one point in time in music. The last thing these people want is to be in a stadium that's not full, pandemic apart, that's not full, and therefore they set a price which is often too low. And that too low leads to a shortage of tickets, which leads to an opportunity to resell those tickets, and that's what ticket touts are on all the time. The cup final football match, the supply curve is interesting because the supply curve for a stadium is actually vertical. It's perfectly inelastic because there's only a certain number of seats in that stadium, and quite often the price for the cup final tickets is set to reward the fan who can't pay all the real high price that could be set at a cup final, and therefore it's set too low, and you'll see on the day people buying second-hand tickets for twice the price, 10 times the price, 20 times the price, or whatever it may be. So Remember that marketplaces don't always look like this. There are marketplaces that go wrong because prices are fixed too high, prices are fixed too low. Sometimes they're set at a maximum, which if the maximum price that you can charge is set below the equilibrium, it'll create a distortion. If it's set above, it won't. The minimum price that you can charge is set above, it will cause a distortion below. Doesn't matter because you'll never reach that price. So the sort of things we're going to add on when we're thinking about how markets work to get a fuller understanding of market theory. So that's all there is as points of interest in market theory, an introduction to the demand side of the economy. The supply side of the economy, the firms, the industries, and the rules, regulations, models that develop in that sector, I'll look at in lecture 3, and then in lecture 4 I'm going to look again in more detail at where these markets fail, how they fail, and what we have to do about them. Thank you for being with me.